The cabin sat where the pines thinned and the earth dipped into a shallow hollow, a place most folks passed without seeing. Its boards were gray with age, the roof patched with mismatched shingles, the porch steps worn smooth by boots that had learned patience. Smoke rose straight from the chimney, thin as a pencil line against the bruised sky. It was late autumn, the hour when daylight drained fast and the woods began to hold their breath. Inside, Thomas Green worked in silence. He laid his rifle on the table the way a man lays down a memory, carefully, with respect. The weapon was long and dark, its stock scarred, its barrel cleaned until it caught the lamplight. He ran an oiled cloth along the metal, slow and exact, checking each notch and screw by touch as much as sight. His hands were steady. They had been steady once on a frozen ridge in Virginia, steady again along a stone wall outside Petersburg, steady when the world was loud and full of dying men. Tonight the world was quiet, and that made him more alert, not less. Thomas moved to the window and parted the curtain just enough to see the tree line. The pines leaned toward the cabin like eavesdroppers. Fog slid between their trunks, low and patient. Somewhere far off a horse snorted. He let the curtain fall back into place. He had chosen this land for a reason. The hollow broke sound, the pines confused distance. The creek behind the cabin cut a narrow channel that would slow any approach from the rear. He had walked every yard of it, counted steps, measured sight lines. He knew where moonlight pooled and where it disappeared entirely. He had learned this place the way a soldier learns a battlefield, by imagining it filled with enemies. The kettle began to sing. Thomas poured hot water over grounds and let the smell of coffee settle him. He drank it black, standing at the table, eyes moving. The habit came from the army: eat when you can, drink when you can, sleep only when the world insists. He set the cup down and reached beneath the floorboard by the hearth, lifting it just enough to draw out a small leather pouch. Inside were cartridges, counted and recounted. He lined them up on the table, then slid them into loops on his belt, leaving a few loose where his fingers could find them without looking. A gust of wind rattled the shutters. He paused, listening. Wind, yes, but something else rode it. A murmur, distant, like many voices trying to agree on a single note. Thomas closed his eyes and let the sound come to him the way it had on picket lines long ago. He remembered the night before a charge, how men talked too much, how the air carried the scrape of boots and the nervous laugh that tried to pass for courage. He went to the door and set his hand against the wood. It was thick oak, salvaged from a burned barn years back. He had reinforced it with iron bands he'd hammered himself. The latch was solid. The hinges didn't squeal. He had fixed them for that very reason. Outside, the murmur grew teeth. Thomas did not pray. Not anymore. Prayer had its place, and his was past. Instead, he breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth. He let the air fill his chest and settle his shoulders. He thought of names, men who had taught him things when the war was young. A white farmer from Ohio who showed him how to read wind by watching grass. A freckled boy from Maine who could pick a lock with a bent nail and laughed as he did it. A captain who'd said, "You don't shoot to kill, Green. You shoot to end the fight." The captain had died the next day. Thomas had lived, and he had remembered. He moved to the corner where a narrow ladder led up to the loft. From there he could see the road. He climbed quietly and eased the shutter aside a finger's width. Torchlight bobbed through the fog, dozens at first, then more, far more. The light painted the trunks gold and made long warped shadows on the ground. White shapes moved among the flames. Hoods, robes, a procession of hate dressed as ritual. 300, he thought, not because he counted, but because the sound had that weight. It pressed on the air. It made the night feel smaller. They came with confidence. Horses snorted and stamped. Men laughed too loudly. Someone began to sing, a low, tuneless thing that broke into hoots and shouts. The torches hissed. The fog swallowed their words and gave them back mangled. Thomas watched until the last of the light slid into the hollow. He closed the shutter and descended. He did not rush. Rushing made mistakes, and mistakes were louder than gunfire. He set the lamp lower and checked the floor near the back wall. A thread, thin as a hair, ran from a nail to a small bell he'd salvaged from a church long since abandoned. He plucked it lightly. No sound. Good. He moved to the hearth and slid a brick aside, revealing a second rifle shorter than the first, better for close quarters. He leaned it against the wall within arm's reach. The voices rose again, closer now. He could hear individual words, ugly, eager. He could hear orders given by men who had never had to earn obedience. The sound stirred something old in his chest, a tightness that had nothing to do with fear. He remembered being hunted before, not by these men, but by others who wore different uniforms and carried different lies. He remembered the dogs. He remembered the way water took the sound of breathing and made it dangerous. He stepped back to the table and lifted the long rifle. The weight settled into him. He went to the window on the far side, the one that looked toward the slope. He opened it just enough to let the barrel through and rested it on the sill. He did not aim yet. He listened. A torch flared near the porch. The boards creaked under unfamiliar boots. Someone rapped on the door, hard, as if knocking could make a man disappear. Another voice called out his name. They knew it. Of course they did. Names traveled faster than men. Thomas did not answer. He waited for the sound that mattered, the shift from noise to intent. It came when the laughter thinned and the voices lowered, when boots spread out and torches formed a ring instead of a cluster. That was when men decided they were done playing. He exhaled and raised the rifle. Through the narrow gap he saw a hooded figure step forward, torch held high, face hidden but posture proud. The flame guttered in the fog, bending toward the barrel like it knew what was coming. Thomas adjusted a fraction, accounting for distance, for the slight downhill grade, for the way fog lied about where a man stood. He felt the trigger meet his finger, the familiar resistance. He thought briefly of the morning after Appomattox, when the guns went quiet and the world felt stunned by its own survival. He thought of walking away from a uniform that never quite fit and into a country that didn't know what to do with him. He thought of building this cabin plank by plank, of choosing solitude because it was honest. The shot broke the night cleanly. The recoil was a handshake. The flame dropped, the figure crumpled, the torch spinning end over end before hissing out in the damp grass. For a heartbeat, there was silence, true silence, shocked and empty. Then the hollow erupted, shouts tangled with screams, horses reared, torches bobbed wildly as men stumbled back into one another. Someone fired blindly into the trees. Someone else shouted orders that no one followed. Fear ran faster than sense. Thomas did not watch the man fall. He was already moving, stepping back from the window, reloading by touch as he crossed the room. He knew what came next. Panic would surge, then anger. They would try to burn him out. They would rush the door. They would split, circle, test. He welcomed their certainty. Certainty made men predictable. He blew out the lamp and the cabin fell into darkness. Only the hearth glowed, banked low enough to paint the room in ember red. He moved to the back, opened the small shutter there, and slipped out into the cold. The woods closed around him like an old coat. Behind him, the cabin stood, quiet again, smoke still rising, as if nothing at all had happened. In the hollow, 300 men learned that the night did not belong to them. The hollow did not return to silence after the shot. It shattered into fragments, voices overlapping, orders colliding, the frantic snort of horses pulling against reins. Torchlight wobbled like a field of nervous fireflies, shadows leaping across trunks and faces, making men look twice their size and half as brave. The fallen torch lay hissing in the damp grass, its smoke crawling low as if trying to escape what it had witnessed. Thomas moved through the woods with the same care he had learned long ago, when moving wrong meant not moving again. He kept to the dark seams between trees, placing his feet where the earth had already been pressed by deer and foxes. The creek murmured behind him, steady and unbothered, a sound he used to measure distance. He did not hurry, he did not linger. He flowed, letting the woods accept him the way they always had. Behind him, men shouted his name again, louder this time, as if volume could fill the space where certainty had been. Someone cursed the fog. Someone else claimed they had seen 2 men, then 3. A rifle cracked, then another, shots flung into darkness with no thought for where they might land. Thomas smiled without humor. He remembered that sound from the war, the sound of men firing because not firing felt worse. He reached the first marker, a shallow notch cut into the bark of a pine, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. He touched it with 2 fingers and angled left, circling back toward the cabin without closing the distance. From here, he could hear them better. He could hear the shift as the bravado thinned, replaced by a brittle edge. He could hear a leader trying to gather his men, his voice cracking on authority it had never earned. Fire bloomed near the porch. Someone had thrown a torch. The flame caught on the dry edge of a step and licked upward. Thomas paused, listening for the sound he feared. A sudden roar, the greedy rush of wood taking flame. It did not come. The damp boards smoldered and spat. He had soaked them for weeks, a little at a time, so no one would notice. The fire faltered, embarrassed. A cheer rose anyway, thin and forced. Men surged forward. Boots hammered the earth. Thomas counted the steps by ear and knew when they crossed the first line. A shout cut off mid-word, followed by a scream that slid into a wet, choking sound. Another man went down hard, swearing, his curse swallowed by the panic of those behind him. Thomas did not see it. He did not need to. The snares had been set to catch ankles, to tangle pride with gravity. He moved again. He slid behind a fallen log and lifted the shorter rifle. From here the slope gave him a clean lane, a narrow window through which torchlight passed like targets on a string. He waited until a cluster bunched too close, until the men leaned inward, peering at the ground where one of their own lay flailing. He fired once. A torch dropped. Darkness rushed in to fill the gap. Shouting spiked. A horse screamed and bolted, its rider spilling into the brush. Thomas shifted, reloaded, fired again. Another single measured shot. He was not counting bodies. He was counting reactions. Each shot was a question asked of the crowd, and the answer came back the same. Confusion, then fear. They tried to spread out. Someone had sense enough for that. Lines formed, men shoulder to shoulder, torches held high. The fog betrayed them, bending the light, stretching distances until men looked closer than they were. Thomas let them come a few steps, then melted away, circling wide. He felt the old calm settle deeper, the place where the world narrowed to angles and timing and breath. It was not pleasure, it was not rage, it was the absence of both. He crossed the creek where the stones were slick and the water cold enough to bite. He stepped where the current broke, letting it carry away sound and scent. On the far bank he paused long enough to scrape his boot against a rock, then moved off at a right angle, light as a thought. Behind him men plunged into the water with curses and splashes, convinced they were close. He listened as they argued about which way he'd gone, their voices pitching high with urgency. A memory surfaced unbidden, a winter night outside Fredericksburg. The river choked with ice, the sound of men drowning louder than the guns. He shook it off and focused on the present. He always did. Near the cabin again, the fire had grown tired. Smoke hung low. Someone had found the bell. It jingled once, weakly, then went silent. A man laughed too hard. Another told him to shut up. Thomas slipped behind the woodpile and took a knee, letting the pile break his outline. He could see faces now, pale in the torchlight, eyes darting. He could see hands shaking as men reloaded. A leader climbed the porch and raised his arms, demanding quiet. It came in pieces. He spoke of numbers, of righteousness, of how no one man could stand against so many. His words fell into the fog and vanished. Thomas watched the man's chest rise and fall. He waited for the pause between sentences. He fired. The leader folded, sliding down the steps like a sack of grain. The quiet that followed was different. It was not shock. It was recognition. They did not charge again. They began to retreat by inches, pulling back from the porch, clustering in small knots. Orders were whispered now. Someone suggested waiting for daylight. Someone else said the man was not alone, that the woods were full of him. Thomas let the idea grow. He moved along the edge of the light, showing himself just enough. A shadow here, a footstep there. A branch snapped at the wrong time. A silhouette crossed between two torches and vanished. Each glimpse planted a seed. A rifle flared near the tree line, and a man screamed, clutching his shoulder. Thomas had fired from a place he'd already left. He listened to the scream fade into whimpers, then silence as others dragged the man away. He felt no satisfaction. He felt the weight of the night pressing on him, the sense that this was not yet finished. They tried once more to burn the cabin, this time smarter, throwing torches at the roof. The flames guttered and died. Damp wood and patience won again. A man cursed the house itself, as if it had chosen a side. Thomas watched from the loft window now, having slipped back inside when the circle loosened. He rested the long rifle on the sill and waited. Minutes stretched, an hour perhaps. Time bent, elastic. Men sat on their heels, torches lowered. The fog thickened, stealing edges. Somewhere a whip-poor will called, its voice steady, unafraid. Thomas breathed with it. Then, far off, a horn sounded. One long note, then two short. A signal. Relief washed through the crowd in a visible wave. Orders came, clipped and sharp. The circle broke. Men began to pull back toward the road, dragging their wounded, muttering excuses to the dark. Thomas did not chase. He never did. He watched until the last torch dipped out of the hollow and the woods reclaimed their shapes. Only then did he lower the rifle and let his shoulders ease. He sat on the floor and leaned against the wall, listening to the house settle, to the small sounds of survival. Smoke thinned. The creek resumed its place in the world. Somewhere a man wept quietly, far enough away that Thomas could pretend not to hear it. When dawn came, it would find the cabin standing and the ground torn with footprints and fear. It would find no answers. Thomas would already be moving, packing light, leaving behind only the certainty he had given them, that the night could belong to someone else, and that some men were not meant to be taken. Dawn did not arrive all at once. It crept into the hollow in cautious strips, thinning the fog, turning the torch smoke into pale ribbons that drifted and dissolved. The woods looked tired, as if they had witnessed something they did not intend to remember. Thomas Green stood at the back window and watched the light test the ground, exposing scuffed earth, broken branches, a dropped hood snagged on a briar like a shed skin. He did not feel triumph. He felt the quiet after a long watch, the kind that left a ringing in the ears. He had learned to distrust quiet. Quiet was where men convinced themselves the danger had passed. He set the rifle down and listened. Birds began their cautious conversation, one call answered by another. The creek kept to its rhythm. No boots, no voices. Still Thomas waited. He counted breaths. He let the morning stretch. When he finally moved, it was with the same care he'd used in the dark. He packed only what mattered: ammunition, water, dried meat wrapped in cloth. The shorter rifle went across his back, the longer one he leaned in the corner, covered, as if it were a piece of furniture. He did not plan to take it with him, not yet. He slid the floorboard back into place and pressed it down until it settled, hiding what he had not used. The house had earned its silence. Outside, the air carried the sour edge of burned pitch and fear. Thomas circled wide, scanning the tree line, stepping around the snares to reset them by habit. Two had been sprung and left where they lay, ugly proof of the night's confusion. He cut one free, coiled the wire, and tucked it away. He left the other where it was, a lesson that would not be taught twice. At the edge of the hollow, he knelt and studied the ground. Tracks tangled and overlapped, a map of indecision. He followed them with his eyes, not his feet, reading the story they told. The first surge forward, the panic, the retreat that pretended to be strategy. He marked where the leader had fallen, the scuffed boards on the porch, the blackened patch where fire had failed. He took it all in and then looked up, beyond the trees, toward the road that led to town. That road would carry the night with it. By mid-morning, the first rider appeared. He came alone, slow, hat in his hands, eyes darting to the woods. Thomas watched from cover, weighing the man's purpose. The rider dismounted near the road and stood there, shifting his weight, listening to the birds as if they might accuse him. He looked like a farmer, mud on his boots, worry in his shoulders. After a long moment he mounted again and left. Word had been taken, and it would not be gentle. Thomas returned to the cabin and shut the door. He sat at the table and drank water, letting it wash the smoke from his throat. He thought of moving on, of slipping north or west, of folding himself back into the wide places where a man could vanish. He had done that before. It had never lasted. Names found him. Stories caught up. He was tired of running from other men's fear. Near noon he heard the sound of wheels. Not wagons, too light, a single cart perhaps. He took the shorter rifle and stepped onto the porch, letting himself be seen. The cart rolled into view, pulled by a mule that looked older than its owner. A woman sat on the bench, her hands tight on the reins. She stopped when she saw him and swallowed. "You all right?" she asked, the words tumbling out fast as if she feared he might vanish mid-sentence. Thomas nodded once. "I am." She looked past him at the scuffed earth, the dark stain on the step. Her eyes filled, but she did not cry. "They say you—" She stopped herself. "They say it was bad." He considered her. He recognized her now, the woman from the creek bend who sold eggs on market days, who never met his eyes but always nodded. "It was loud," he said. She managed a thin smile. That it was, she shifted on the bench. Men are coming, from town, not like last night. Different. How different, he asked. She hesitated. Law, he let the word sit. Law had worn many faces in his life. Some smiled, most did not. Thank you, he said. She nodded, relief loosening her grip on the reins. As she turned the cart, she glanced back once. You ought to go, she said, not unkindly. Thomas watched her leave. He stood on the porch until the dust settled and the sound of the wheels faded. Then he went inside and closed the door. The law arrived in the early afternoon. 2 wagons, 3 horses, 6 men. They did not wear hoods. They wore badges pinned crooked and carried rifles that had seen better days. They approached slow, calling out, hands visible. Thomas met them halfway, stopping where the ground dipped. The man in front had a red face and a practiced squint. Afternoon, he said. We're here about last night. So am I, Thomas replied. The man cleared his throat. Reports of trouble, property damage, shots fired. By whom? Thomas asked. The man's eyes flicked to the woods, then back. That's what we're sorting. Another man spoke up, younger, uneasy. You alone here? Thomas did not answer immediately. He thought of the hollow, of the way the woods had carried him. I am, he said at last. The red-faced man nodded as if that settled something. We'll take a look around. Thomas stepped aside. They moved past him, poking at the ground with the butts of their rifles, murmuring. One man climbed the porch and bent to examine the blackened wood. Another prodded the snare and cursed. The younger one kept his eyes on Thomas, curiosity wrestling with fear. You fire on them? The red-faced man asked, not looking up. They fired first, Thomas said. It was true enough. He let the lie rest in the space between them. The man grunted. Any bodies? Not here. A pause. Wind stirred the trees. Somewhere a bird scolded. Well, the man said finally, straightening, you best keep the peace. This kind of thing draws attention. Thomas met his gaze. So does a mob. The man's mouth tightened. He seemed to consider arguing, then thought better of it. We'll be in town, he said, if you need anything. Thomas nodded. They left without shaking hands. By evening the road had learned the story. Men passed without stopping, hats low, eyes sliding away. A few slowed, staring, measuring the cabin as if it were a person who had spoken out of turn. Children were kept close. Doors shut early. The hollow held its breath again. Thomas sat on the porch as the light failed. He felt the ache in his bones now, the honest accounting of the night's work. He thought of the horn call, the retreat. He knew better than to believe it was finished. Fear did not disappear, it gathered. After dark, a boy came running. He was breathless, eyes bright with the dangerous shine of purpose. They're saying things, he blurted, in town, saying you ain't alone, saying you're... He stopped, embarrassed, saying you're a ghost. Thomas almost smiled. Ghosts don't need warning, he said gently. You should go home. The boy lingered. They say more are coming. Then you should be gone, Thomas said, firmer now. The boy nodded and ran. Thomas rose and went inside. He lit the lamp low and sat at the table, hands flat on the wood. He felt the weight of the day settle into him. He could leave, he could vanish before dawn, slip through places the map forgot, or he could stay and let the story harden around the cabin, draw men like moths to a flame that did not burn out. He thought of the leader on the porch, of the certainty that had bled out of the night with him. He thought of the woman with the eggs, of the boy's bright fear. He thought of the war, of how men learned too late that ground mattered. He stood and went to the corner. He uncovered the long rifle and checked it, running his thumb along the scarred stock. He leaned it back, ready. Outside the wood shifted. The hollow listened, and Thomas Green, who had ended one fight to begin another, settled himself to wait, knowing the night would test them again, and that the answer would not be shouted but measured, one breath at a time. Night came back heavier than before, as if it had learned something and decided to press its advantage. Clouds swallowed the moon early, leaving the hollow to the mercy of starlight that barely reached the ground. The woods no longer whispered, they waited. Thomas felt it in the way the air clung to his skin, in the way sound seemed to stop short of traveling where it should. He did not light the lamp. He sat in the dark with his back to the wall, the shorter rifle across his knees, the long one within reach. He had moved things again. Chairs shifted, the table angled, a clear lane cut through the room from window to door. He had closed off the loft access, knowing curiosity could be as dangerous as courage. He had reset the bell, replaced the thread, checked each knot with the care of a man tying off a life. The boy's warning replayed in his head, not the words but the look in his eyes. Fear had teeth now. Fear traveled. It brought friends. Near midnight the woods exhaled. It began with a sound so soft it could have been a trick of memory, the crunch of a boot on leaf litter, distant, deliberate. Thomas closed his eyes and counted. Another crunch, closer, then nothing. He waited through the ache in his legs, through the itch at the base of his neck. He had learned not to chase silence. Silence wanted company. A second sound came from the opposite side. Then a third. Not loud. Careful. Men who had learned something, even if they didn't know what to call it yet. Thomas felt a flicker of respect, quickly extinguished. Learning did not make them different. It made them dangerous. He eased to the window and lifted the curtain a finger's width. No torches. That was new. Shapes moved where the fog thinned, darker than the dark. He could not count them, and that mattered more than numbers. He lowered the curtain and shifted to the back, placing his weight where the floor would not betray him. A pebble tapped the wall. Another followed, then a third, testing. Thomas smiled without warmth. He reached under the hearth brick and took out a small pouch, fingers finding the glass without looking. He crossed to the window and, with a practiced flick, sent a bottle arcing into the yard. It shattered softly, releasing a smell sharp enough to cut through the damp. He stepped back. A man coughed. Another swore. The wind carried the confusion inward, and Thomas let it, breathing shallow, eyes fixed. He heard boots retreat, heard men arguing in hisses. The hollow shifted again, as if annoyed. They tried the back next. A weight pressed against the door, slow, testing. Thomas braced himself and waited for the latch to strain. It did not. He heard the scrape of metal instead, a blade searching for the seam. He raised the rifle, aimed at the door where the blade would slide through, and waited. The blade appeared, thin and hopeful. Thomas fired once. The report was deafening in the closed space. The blade vanished. A scream tore the night open and ran until it broke. Thomas did not move. He reloaded by touch, listening to the sudden scramble as men dragged someone away. Silence followed, thick and resentful. Minutes stretched. Sweat cooled on his spine. He could feel the hollow thinking, men thinking with it. He had the sense of being weighed, measured not just as a man but as a problem. Then came the fire. Not thrown this time. Carried. He saw the glow bloom against the window, felt the heat kiss the glass. Smoke slid in through the cracks, tasting bitter. Thomas moved, grabbing the bucket he had filled earlier, splashing water against the boards. Steam hissed, angry. He moved again, dousing another spot, then another. Outside, men cursed. The fire faltered but did not die. A crash at the front window sent glass raining inward. Thomas dropped, rolled, came up behind the table. A torch sailed through the opening and clattered to the floor, its flame licking hungrily. He kicked it into the hearth and slammed the iron screen shut. Sparks jumped and died. He did not wait for the next move. He burst through the back door and into the night, cutting left, then right, breaking his line the way he always had. The woods welcomed him, swallowing his shape. He ran low and fast, then slowed, letting his breath settle. He circled wide, coming up behind the glow. From the trees, he watched them swarm the cabin. No longer careful, now angry. Shadows leaped across their robes. He saw faces through slits, teeth bared, eyes shining with a dangerous relief. They thought they had flushed him. They thought the house was the thing that mattered. Thomas raised the long rifle. He fired once, then moved. Fired again from a different angle. A man dropped, then another. Panic spiked. Torches swung wildly. A shot went wide, tearing bark from a pine inches from Thomas's head. He slid behind the trunk, heart steady, mind cold. He fired again, choosing men who shouted orders, men who pointed. They scattered, then clumped, then scattered again. Horses screamed. A wagon overturned. Fire leapt where it shouldn't, caught on robes, was beaten out with bare hands. Thomas kept moving, never staying long enough to be guessed. He used the hollow's curves, the way sound bent and light lied. He felt a sting at his arm, sharp and sudden. A graze. He ignored it. He fired again. Another shout cut off. The night fractured into small, desperate pieces. A horn sounded, closer this time, urgent. Thomas paused, listening. He recognized a pattern now. Not retreat, but rally. More were coming. He weighed the cost and the clock. He could fade back into the woods, leave them the cabin, the story, the ashes. Or he could break them again, harder, teach the lesson until it stuck. He chose the latter. Because he was tired of lessons being optional, he slipped toward the creek, moving upstream, then doubled back, appearing where they did not expect him. He fired low, spooking horses, sending riders tumbling. He shattered torches, plunging pockets into darkness. He let his shadow be seen crossing a rise, then vanished. Each glimpse sharpened the fear, made it personal. They tried to answer with volume. Shots cracking into the trees shouted curses. Thomas counted the shots, marked the pauses, timed his movement between them. He remembered a captain's voice, calm as a church bell. Wait for the breath after the shout. He did. When the horn sounded again, it carried a different note. Not command, plea. Men began to pull back, dragging the wounded, calling for one another. Fire was abandoned where it fell. The cabin still burned in places, but the flames were small, ashamed. Thomas watched until the glow receded, until the hollow loosened its grip. He did not return to the house immediately. He moved to the creek and washed the blood from his arm, binding it tight. He drank and waited, listening for the lie of safety to settle. Only then did he circle back. The cabin stood, blackened but stubborn. Smoke drifted lazily. Thomas stepped inside and leaned the door closed. He slid down the wall and sat on the floor, letting the tremor pass through him at last. It did not last long. It never did. As dawn hinted at itself again, pale and unsure, Thomas rose. He looked at the scars on the walls, the broken window, the scorched boards. He thought of the lawmen, of town, of how stories would harden overnight. He thought of the boy, of the woman, of the way fear learned. He gathered what he needed. He did not pack to leave, not yet. He stepped onto the porch and watched the light test the hollow once more. They would come again, changed by what they had learned, and so would he. Morning broke thin and pale, like it was unsure whether it wanted to be seen. The smoke from the night still hung low, drifting in soft grey sheets that caught the early light and bent it into strange shapes. Thomas stood on the porch, the ache in his arm now a dull, steady pulse, and watched the hollow wake up around him. The woods looked the same as they always had, but he knew better. Ground remembered, trees remembered, and men remembered most of all. He went inside and set about making the cabin livable again. Broken glass was swept into a pile and carried out, the scorched boards doused and scraped clean. He worked slowly, deliberately, letting the rhythm of simple tasks steady his breathing. Survival was not just about fighting, it was about refusing to let chaos decide the shape of your day. By mid-morning, riders came again, but not in a mob. 2 this time. They stopped well short of the porch, hands visible, eyes uneasy. Thomas watched them from the doorway, not moving to greet them, not retreating either. He let them feel the distance. "We're not here for trouble," one called. His voice wavered despite his effort to sound firm. "Just talk." Thomas stepped down from the porch and stopped halfway between them and the house. "Talk," he agreed. They exchanged a glance. The older one cleared his throat. "Town's stirred up, folks saying all manner of things, saying last night weren't just a fight, saying it was a war." Thomas did not correct him. "They say you killed men," the younger rider added quickly, then winced as if expecting a shot for his honesty. "I defended my home," Thomas said. "What happened to those who came with fire was their choosing." Silence stretched. A crow cawed somewhere behind them. The older rider nodded slowly. "There's fear," he said, "not just of you, of what this means. Men are talking about bringing more from farther out." Thomas felt the weight of the words settle into his chest. He had known this was coming. Violence, once unleashed, never traveled alone. It brought cousins and friends and men who wanted to prove something to themselves. "Then tell them this," Thomas said. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "I will not leave, and I will not be taken." The riders looked at him, really looked this time, not as a rumor, not as a story, but as a man standing solid on his own ground. The younger one swallowed. The older nodded once, as if marking a boundary. "We'll pass it along," he said. They turned and rode away, not looking back. Thomas watched until they disappeared beyond the trees. He felt no relief, only clarity. That afternoon the hollow filled with sound again, but different now, not boots and shouts, but whispers carried on the wind. People came to the edges of the woods and did not step closer. Some left food near the creek, a loaf of bread, a jar of beans, offerings made quietly. Others came only to look, to measure the cabin with their eyes and imagine the man inside it. By evening, Thomas understood something important. The cabin was no longer just his. It had become a symbol and symbols drew fire. As the sun slid low, he prepared. He moved supplies to the back, buried what he could not carry, marked paths only he would recognize. He set the long rifle aside and strapped the shorter one across his back. He was not planning to abandon the hollow, but he was done letting the fight come only on their terms. Night arrived with purpose. The first sound came from the road, a wagon this time, heavy, slow. Thomas watched from the trees as it stopped just beyond the dip. Men climbed down, not 300, not even 50, a dozen, maybe 20, enough to be dangerous, enough to be bold. They carried lanterns instead of torches and ropes instead of fire. They talked quietly, confidently. These were men who believed the worst was already over. Thomas moved. He did not fire first. He let them step into the hollow, let them feel safe. When the wagon rolled forward, he cut right and slipped behind it, unseen. With one clean motion, he slashed a harness strap and vanished. The mule screamed and bolted, dragging the wagon sideways, spilling men into the dirt. Shouts erupted. Lanterns swung wildly. Thomas fired once, shattering glass and plunging half the clearing into darkness. He moved again, circling, letting them hear him without seeing him. He fired low, then high, never from the same place twice. Panic bloomed fast. A man tripped over a snare and went down hard, his cry sharp and sudden. Another stumbled into him. Someone fired blindly, the shot tearing leaves from a tree. Thomas answered with a single precise crack. The shooter dropped, lantern rolling from his hand. "Fall back," someone shouted. "He's everywhere!" Thomas did not chase. He advanced. He let himself be seen for just a moment, stepping into lantern light, rifle raised, face calm. The sight of him froze them, not because of the weapon, but because he did not look like a man cornered. He fired once more. Another lantern burst. Darkness surged. The men broke. They ran for the road, dragging the wounded, leaving ropes and gear behind. The wagon lay on its side, wheels spinning uselessly. Thomas stood in the hollow and watched them flee, his breath slow, controlled. When silence returned, it felt different again. Not the tense quiet of waiting, not the shocked quiet of aftermath. This was resignation. Thomas returned to the cabin and sat on the porch as dawn crept in for the third time. He felt older now, not weaker but heavier, as if the land itself had pressed some of its history into his bones. He knew this could not continue forever. Each night would bring another test, another escalation, but he also knew something else. They were afraid now. Not of the dark, not of the woods, of him. As the sun rose, lighting the scars on the cabin and the churned earth of the hollow, Thomas Green rested his rifle against the porch rail and watched the world wake carefully around him. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. He simply stayed. And in staying, he made it clear that the story would not end the way they wanted. The fourth dawn came with rain. It fell gently at first, a thin curtain that softened the edges of the hollow and darkened the scars in the earth. Smoke stains blurred. Footprints filled with water and disappeared. The land began, quietly, to erase the night. Thomas sat on the porch with a blanket over his shoulders, watching the rain bead along the rail, feeling the deep tiredness settle into places he had learned not to name. Fear had changed its shape. He could feel that too. By mid-morning, the road carried a different sound. Wagons, many this time, their wheels heavy with intention, not rushing, not sneaking, coming openly as if daylight itself were a shield. Thomas stood and stepped down into the wet grass, rifle slung but not raised. He did not go to meet them. He waited where the ground dipped, where he could be seen without offering the house behind him. They arrived in numbers that no longer tried to hide what they were. Men from town, men from beyond it. Some wore badges, some carried Bibles, some had nothing but rope and the belief that numbers made them righteous. They fanned out, but stopped short of the hollow's center, as if an invisible line had been drawn and they did not trust themselves to cross it. A man dismounted and walked forward alone. He was older than the others, grey at the temples, coat buttoned tight against the rain. His boots were polished, impractical for mud. He stopped 10 paces away. "Thomas Green," he said, not as a challenge but as a statement. Thomas nodded once. "You've made this difficult," the man went on, "for everyone." Thomas looked past him at the gathered faces, some hard, some curious, some frightened in a way they would never admit. "I didn't begin it." "No," the man agreed quietly, "but you finished more than one thing." Rain pattered between them. Somewhere a horse stamped. "There are men dead," the man said, "wounded, broken." Stories spreading faster than truth ever could. Thomas's jaw tightened. "They came to burn my home. They came to kill me." "And you stopped them," the man said. "Effectively." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The man lifted a hand and it stilled. "This can't continue," he said. "You know that," Thomas did. He had known it since the second night, when fear learned and adapted. "What do you want?" he asked. The man hesitated. That hesitation told Thomas more than words. "You to leave," he said finally, quietly, "before this turns into something no one controls." "And if I don't?" Thomas asked. The man's eyes flicked to the rifles, the ropes, the men who had come to feel important. "Then the law will do what the law does." Thomas breathed in the rain. He smelled wet earth, iron, old smoke. He thought of the woman with the eggs, the boy with the warning, the offerings left by the creek. He thought of the hollow, of how it had held him when the world would not. "I fought for this country," he said, his voice steady. "I bled for it. I earned the right to stand on my own ground." The man did not argue that. Instead, he said, "And that is why you're still standing." Silence stretched again, heavy and unresolved. From the back of the crowd, a shout broke free, angry, raw. "He's a killer!" Another voice joined it. Then another. The sound swelled, threatening to tip. Thomas felt the shift before it happened. He raised his rifle, not to aim but to rest it upright against his shoulder. The simple motion caught the eye. The crowd quieted, not because they were ordered to, but because they remembered. "I will leave," Thomas said. The words landed like stones in water, sending ripples outward. "But not hunted," he continued, "not chased. I will go when I choose by a road I choose, and this ends here." The man studied him for a long moment. Rain traced lines down his face, washing it clean of certainty. "If you go," he said slowly, "there will be no pursuit." Thomas nodded. "Then we are agreed." The crowd shifted again, disappointment and relief tangled together. Some men wanted blood, others wanted the story to stop. Thomas turned and walked back toward the cabin. No one followed. He packed lightly, he always had. What mattered fit into a small satchel. He left the long rifle leaning in the corner, wrapped in cloth, a gift to the house that had stood with him. The shorter rifle went across his back. He took the food left by the creek, not out of need, but out of respect. Before he stepped away, he paused in the doorway and looked back. The cabin was scarred, blackened, but standing. So was he. By the time the wagons rolled away, Thomas was already moving through the woods, following a path that did not exist on any map. The rain thickened, erasing him with care. Days later, the hollow was quiet again. Men came to look and found nothing to prove their stories. No traps, no ghost. Just a burned porch and the sense that something had passed through and chosen not to stay. In town, the story grew anyway. It changed in the telling. Some said 300 men had been driven off by one. Others said the woods themselves had risen. Some swore Thomas Green had vanished into the earth, had become part of it. Years passed. Children were warned not to wander near the hollow after dark. Riders slowed there, unthinking, hats tipping in respect they could not explain. And every so often, when the wind moved just right through the pines, someone would swear they heard the measured crack of a rifle far off, followed by silence. Some men are hunted, others decide when the hunt ends, and the land remembers the difference.